I knew something was wrong the second I saw the tire tracks cutting across the frost behind my west pasture, because nobody was supposed to be back there except me, and whoever had been there sure as hell wasn't trying to hide it. Deep grooves, fresh mud, diesel smell still hanging in the morning air, and down in the gravel basin, right where the creek bends around the cedar trees, the wall had been carved clean out like somebody had taken a giant bite straight through the earth. I just sat there in my truck for a second staring at it, coffee going cold in my hand, thinking the same thing over and over. There is no way somebody was dumb enough to steal gravel from a man who literally lives on the property. Now, if you've never lived around rural Missouri, gravel probably sounds like the dumbest thing in the world to fight over. Most people hear gravel pit and picture a pile of rocks beside a highway somewhere. But this wasn't some random patch of dirt. My grandfather found that river rock deposit back in the late 70s while digging a stock pond, and over time it turned into one of the few things on our land that actually made steady money. Nothing flashy, nothing millionaire level, just dependable. Contractors would haul from it, county crews would buy from it, and every month I'd get enough from the lease to keep taxes paid and equipment running without stressing every season. After my divorce a few years back, that pit honestly kept me afloat. There were months I'd sit on the porch wondering whether I should just sell the whole place and move into town somewhere smaller, but every time I thought about leaving, I'd look out across that land and remember my dad teaching me fence work out there, my mom planting tomatoes beside the old barn, my granddad smoking cigarettes on the tailgate talking about how land only loves people who stay loyal to it. Corny old farmer wisdom, but when you're alone long enough, those voices stick around in your head. Then Caleb Turner bought the property next to mine. And right away, something about the guy rubbed me wrong. Not because he was rich. Hell, plenty of wealthy folks buy ranch land out here nowadays pretending they're cowboys on weekends. But because Caleb carried himself like the entire county was temporary scenery built for his convenience. He came down from Kansas City in this black Range Rover that looked cleaner than my kitchen floor, wearing a quilted vest and expensive boots that had clearly never touched manure a day in their life. First conversation we ever had, he smiled the whole time without actually looking me in the eye. He said, "Beautiful spread you got here." I said, "Appreciate it." Then he pointed toward the gravel pit behind my property and asked, real casual, "That active?" I remember hesitating for half a second before answering because something about the question felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. "Yeah," I told him. "Been leased out for years." He nodded slowly like he was mentally calculating something, then laughed a little and said, "Must be nice having money sitting in the ground." At the time I just brushed it off. People say weird things all the time. But looking back now, that was probably the moment this whole mess started. Over the next month or so, Caleb kept showing up. Sometimes he'd stop by while I was repairing fence lines. Other times he'd wave me over while his contractors were surveying his land. He talked constantly about development plans, luxury cabins, private fishing ponds, wedding venues for city people trying to cosplay country life for a weekend. Every conversation somehow circled back to money. One afternoon he stood beside me watching dump trucks load gravel from my pit and said, "You ever think about expanding operations?" I laughed and told him, "Man, I'm 58 years old. Expanding sounds exhausting." He grinned at that, but there was something behind the grin I didn't trust. Like he thought I was wasting something he deserved better. About 6 weeks later, my lease operator, Ronnie, called me on a Sunday morning sounding confused. "Hey Earl," he said, "you running trucks today?" "Nope." "Well, somebody sure is." That was the first moment I felt that little twist in my gut, the kind you get right before life suddenly becomes a whole lot more complicated. I drove out there faster than I should have, bouncing my old Ford across the pasture hard enough to spill coffee all over the console, and the closer I got to the pit, the quieter I became. You ever notice how your brain gets real calm right before you find something bad? Like deep down your body already knows what's waiting for you before your eyes catch up. That's exactly how it felt pulling over beside the basin that morning, because before I even stepped out, I could see fresh scrape marks running down the sidewalls and chunks missing from the loading edge where Ronnie usually staged material for pickup. And there they were, tire tracks everywhere. Not one truck, multiple trucks. I climbed down into the pit myself and just stood there with my hands on my hips trying to estimate it. I'd worked around gravel long enough to eyeball tonnage pretty accurately. Somebody had hauled off at least 200 tons, maybe more. That's not some teenager stealing copper wire in the middle of the night. That takes loaders, fuel, drivers, coordination. It takes somebody who believes they're untouchable. I called Ronnie back. You got any scheduled pulls this weekend? No, sir. Anybody ask permission? Nope. Then he got quiet for a second before saying, You thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, I said. I am. I called Caleb right there standing in the pit. And I swear to God, the man answered cheerful. Earl, what's going on? I said, You got trucks pulling gravel out of my pit. Little pause. Then he goes, Oh yeah, that was us. Like we were discussing borrowed hedge clippers. I remember blinking a few times because my brain genuinely couldn't process the confidence in his voice. You stole from me, I told him. He laughed. Actually laughed. Come on, Earl, don't make it dramatic. I needed base material for the access roads, and your pit's right there. I figured we'd settle up later. I said, Later ain't permission. Then his tone changed a little. Still polite, but colder underneath. You're getting emotional over rock. No, I told him. I'm getting angry over a man trespassing on my land and helping himself to my property. Another pause. Then he hit me with the line that stuck in my head for months. You country guys are always so territorial. Man, something about that sentence crawled under my skin. Not because of the insult itself, but because I suddenly realized Caleb genuinely believed rural people were too dumb or too passive to fight back. In his mind, this land wasn't a home or a legacy. It was just undeveloped opportunity sitting around waiting for smarter people to claim it. I told him he owed me immediately for every ton taken. He sighed like I was inconveniencing him and said, My financing closes in a couple weeks. I'll throw you extra for the trouble. Throw me extra. Like he was tipping a valet. I hung up before I said something stupid. Now here's the thing people don't understand unless they've lived through disputes like this. It's never really about the money. Not fully. Sure, the gravel mattered. But deeper than that, somebody crossed onto my family's land, took something without asking, then acted annoyed that I had a problem with it. That kind of disrespect sits in your chest different. I called my attorney, Daniel Harper. Old school property lawyer out of Jefferson City. Gray mustache, suspenders, hunted turkey every spring. Guy looked like he belonged in a feed store more than a courtroom, but he was sharp as broken glass. I explained everything. First thing Daniel asked was, Did he admit it directly? Yep. You got witnesses? Lease records too. He went quiet for a second, then said, Well, sounds like your neighbor just turned a civil issue into a criminal one. By that afternoon, Deputy Ray Dolan was standing beside me at the pit taking photos while I walked him through the missing material. Ray had known me 20 years. Good deputy. Calm guy. The kind that listens more than he talks. At one point he crouched down near the tire tracks and muttered, Hell of a thing to steal. I said, You ever arrest somebody over gravel before? He smirked. Not yet. Then we drove over to Caleb's development site together. And there it was. My gravel. Spread across his access roads fresh and clean like frosting on a damn cake. Ray looked at the roads, then looked at me. Well, he said quietly, that simplifies things. About an hour later, Caleb called me absolutely furious. You sent the sheriff to my property? I said, You stole from mine. For gravel. For felony theft. He went silent for a second like the word felony had finally pierced through whatever rich guy bubble he lived inside. Then came the threats. You know how much money I've got tied up in this project? That sounds like a you problem. You really want to start a war with your neighbor? That line made me laugh harder than it should have. Because the war had already started. I was just the last one informed. A couple days later, his attorney reached out offering me $1,200 to resolve the misunderstanding. Daniel nearly spit coffee across his desk reading the letter. Misunderstanding, he said. Your client wasn't confused. He was loading trucks. So we filed suit. And that's when Caleb stopped pretending to be friendly. Before all this, whenever we crossed paths, he'd wave, smile, play businessman cowboy. After the lawsuit, different story. Now he'd stare at me from across property lines like I'd embarrassed him publicly, which honestly, I had. One evening I caught him parked beside the fence, just watching my gravel operation through binoculars. No joke. I walked over and asked, You bird watching? He lowered the binoculars slow and said, You're making a mistake, Earl. I leaned on the fence and said, Pretty sure the mistake was stealing from me twice your age thinking I'd roll over. His jaw tightened at that. You have any idea who my investors are? I laughed. Buddy, This county barely has cell service. I don't care who your investors are. That was the moment I realized something important about Caleb Turner. He wasn't used to hearing no. Not from contractors, not from employees, probably not from anybody. Men like that build entire identities around getting their way. And when somebody finally pushes back, they take it personal. So I installed a steel gate at the pit entrance, heavy chain, industrial lock, plus a full camera system Ronnie helped me set up overlooking the loading area. Cost me a chunk of money too. At the time I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. I'm fortifying a gravel pit like it's Fort Knox. But deep down, I think I already knew Caleb wasn't done yet. And 2 weeks later, at exactly 2:13 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand beside my bed. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed half asleep expecting deer. Instead, I saw sparks flying in the dark. Somebody was cutting my lock. I don't think I've ever gone from half asleep to fully awake that fast in my entire life. 1 second I was lying there trying to figure out why my phone was buzzing. Next thing I'm staring at live footage of 2 men with bolt cutters standing at my gate, while a loader idled behind them throwing diesel smoke into the night air. And the craziest part? The truck parked behind the loader had Caleb Turner Development printed right across the side in giant white letters like they weren't even worried about getting caught anymore. I just sat there staring for maybe 3 seconds thinking, no way. No way this man is actually dumb enough to do this again while he's already being sued for the first theft. Then one of them cut the chain. And honestly, that's the moment I stopped being angry and started feeling something closer to disbelief. Because once somebody gets that arrogant, they stop thinking rules apply to them at all. They start treating consequences like things that only happen to regular people. I called Deputy Ray before I even put my boots on. Ray, I said, they're back. His voice woke up real quick after that. By the time I reached the pit, hiding my truck behind the tree line near the creek, they were already loading the second dump truck. Floodlights bounced off the gravel walls while the loaders scooped bucket after bucket like they owned the place. I remember hearing frogs down by the water and diesel engines rumbling together in the dark, and for some reason the whole thing felt weirdly surreal, like I was watching somebody else's life instead of mine. Then headlights appeared coming down the access road. Sheriff's unit. Everything changed instantly. One worker dropped his cigarette. Another guy froze halfway, climbing out of the loader. And standing beside the trucks in a brown work jacket was Caleb himself, phone in one hand, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Deputy Ray stepped out slow, calm as ever. Well, he said looking around. This feels familiar. Nobody spoke. Ray walked over to the busted gate first, shined his flashlight on the cut chain, then looked directly at Caleb. You want to explain this to me? And Caleb, God bless this idiot, actually tried. We had standing access permission before the dispute escalated. Ray blinked once. There's a locked gate. Caleb shifted his weight. We believed. Ray cut him off. No. You hope. Man, I still think about that line sometimes. You hoped. Because that's exactly what Caleb had been doing from the beginning. Hoping rural people wouldn't document things. Hoping nobody would push back. Hoping money and confidence could blur reality enough to protect him. Instead, one of his drivers ended up in handcuffs before sunrise. The next month was pure chaos. Daniel filed emergency motions. The county prosecutor added criminal trespassing charges on top of the second felony theft case. Caleb's investors started getting nervous because apparently banks don't love hearing words like active criminal investigation attached to development loans. And then came the hearing. Now I'll tell you something honest. I expected courtroom drama to feel exciting, but mostly it's uncomfortable. Everybody talks quieter than you expect. Nobody looks as confident as they pretend to. Even Caleb looked smaller sitting there at the defense table in a Navy suit that probably cost more than my truck payment. Judge Miriam Holloway turned out to be the exact wrong judge for a guy like him too. Former farm kid. Sharp-eyed. Didn't tolerate arrogance. When the security footage played in court, you could actually hear the chain snap through the speakers. Clink. Then sparks. Then Caleb's company trucks rolling into my pit like raccoons breaking into a feed shed. Judge Holloway watched the whole thing without changing expression once. Then she folded her hands and asked Caleb's attorney, "At what point exactly was your client under the impression that cutting a lock suggested permission?" Silence. I almost felt bad for the lawyer, honestly. Not for Caleb, though. Never Caleb. By the end of that hearing, the judge granted a permanent injunction against him, approved damages for the stolen material, reimbursement for my security upgrades, attorney fees, and punitive damages specifically because he repeated the theft after legal notice. That part mattered to her. Repeated conduct. She looked directly at Caleb before issuing the ruling and said, "Mr. Turner, the court has difficulty believing this was confusion when your response to being accused of theft was to return in the middle of the night with bolt cutters." Even Daniel had to hide a smile after that. But somehow, Caleb still wasn't done humiliating himself. A few weeks later, Daniel discovered Caleb had listed portions of his development property for sale using promotional packets claiming private gravel access as a future commercial asset, meaning he was literally using my gravel pit to inflate his land value for investors. When Daniel showed me the listing brochure, I laughed so hard coffee came out my nose. "You're kidding me." "Nope," he said. "Your neighbor appears committed to self-destruction." That triggered a complaint with the state real estate board, which led to fines, suspended listings, and apparently a whole lot of angry phone calls between Caleb and his financial partners. Word spread fast after that too, because small-town counties survive on gossip the same way trucks survive on diesel. Suddenly, the fancy developer from Kansas City wasn't viewed as some visionary businessman anymore. He was the moron who got arrested stealing gravel twice. And honestly, the money stopped matching by then. Sure, the final number hurt him bad. Between court judgments, fines, legal fees, delays, investor fallout, and eventually selling the property below purchase price, people estimated the whole disaster cost him somewhere around 90 grand. All over a few $1,000s worth of rock. But what stayed with me wasn't the victory. It was the realization that some people genuinely believe kindness is weakness until they finally slam into somebody willing to stand their ground. Last I heard, Caleb moved to Arizona after unloading the property at a loss. The cabins never got built. The wedding venue never happened. Nature slowly started reclaiming the cleared land like the whole project had been rejected by the county itself. Meanwhile, I still walked down to that gravel pit most mornings with coffee in hand, checking the creek, listening to birds wake up through the trees, thinking about how close I came to letting somebody bully me off my own ground just because they wore expensive boots and spoke confidently. Funny thing is, if Caleb had asked respectfully that very first day, I probably would have sold him every load of gravel he needed at a fair price. Instead, he tried to take it, and that decision cost him almost everything. So here's what I want to know from you guys. Do you think I went too far taking him to court over gravel? Or do people like Caleb only learn lessons when the consequences finally hurt? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, small-town justice, and people getting exactly what they earned, hit like and subscribe because trust me, out here in the country, the craziest stories usually start with somebody thinking nobody's watching.